This session is a regulatory workshop. It was my intention to cover a lot of the developments in the state level, but it looks like we don't have that much time. So what I'm going to do is kind of start by talking about, very briefly some of the things I'm seeing at the state level, talk briefly about federal policy, but I think this discussion was catalyzed by two things. Number one is about a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, I was up in Jefferson City, Missouri, talking to some lawmakers, and ran into State Representative Philip Cristofanilli, who's a Republican from St. Charles, who's very interested in modeling the Wyoming framework in Missouri. The second thing is at 4:30, an old friend of mine who is now running for Congress in Missouri's 4th Congressional District is going to be here. And he's very pro-Bitcoin, he's very pro-blockchain, fintech. I'm going to talk about the politics of this here in a little bit, but I think it's very clear right now that we need to be electing more state and federal lawmakers who not only understand these issues but also are willing to champion them. So let's start real quick. So how many here are very familiar with what's happening in Wyoming? Okay. For those of you who aren't familiar, about 4 years ago, Wyoming began kind of a revolution in terms of legislation. They passed 13 bills by 2019, and then the last 2 years I think they've passed some more bills, but they've done everything from integrate digital assets into their Uniform Commercial Code. They've created state charters for banks to hold digital assets. They've created a specialized court to adjudicate issues that would be relevant to digital assets. So this is kind of like Delaware, right? Delaware is the nation's best jurisdiction for incorporating a business because they have such a specialized court system for adjudicating business issues and disputes, right? Wyoming has done that for Bitcoin and blockchain and digital assets, right? And then in 2021, Wyoming passed a piece of legislation to allow decentralized autonomous organizations, DAOs, to incorporate as businesses. And this, to me, this is amazing. In the last year, 31 states have passed or seen action on legislation to protect everything from digital assets to recognize decentralized organizations, to create regulations that exempt Bitcoin or cryptocurrency from money transmission regulations. We're really seeing a lot of advancement at the state level. Now, if you're familiar with what's happening at the federal level, right, it seems to be like a very much opposite story. You had the infrastructure bill passed last night with that, very irksome 5060I provision, right? But it's gone to the president. Yeah, it's gone to the president. So that's bad news, right? But it's not the end of the world. For one, most of the crypto provisions in the infrastructure bill do not take effect until 2024. So we have a few years to roll back these bad regulations, right? Some of these regulations give Treasury a lot of discretion and a lot of interpretive space to take bad ideas and really run with them. But if we can get Congress to address these in the next year, next 2 years, next 3 years, I think we'll be okay, right? So I see Dr. Del Wright from UMKC Law School over there. He's really much more of an expert on the SEC and other federal regulatory agencies than I am. But I will tell you that one of the things that's happened is the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Commodities Futures Trading Commission are kind of in a quiet war with each other over regulatory control of this space, right? So there's a lot of things that are happening at the federal level that really are breeding regulatory uncertainty and confusion and doing a lot to drive innovation, entrepreneurship, businesses out of the United States. While there's a lot of things at the state level that are happening to recognize, codify, and protect these industries. So it's an interesting dynamic, I think, right now between what the federal government is doing and what the states are doing, right? So I'm a state lobbyist. My background is in marijuana reform and drug policy generally and criminal justice. I work with former U.S. Attorney Barry Grissom here in the state of Kansas. I've worked with him on a number of clemency and criminal justice issues. We actually got 25 pardons from President Trump. We're continuing to work with this White House and some other clemency and criminal justice issues. In the state of Missouri, I've had the experience and the pleasure of really advancing some issues that no one had any idea of 10 years ago. So I have a political experience with taking a very conservative state, taking very conservative lawmakers, and kind of developing an issue to the point where it's salient, where it's understood, where it's actionable. So I'm hoping that these lessons can translate over to what we want to do in Missouri. In Iowa, I've been working with State Representative Jeff Shipley. Jeff Shipley, he's from southeastern corner of Iowa. He's another pioneer in terms of drug policy, criminal justice, and he has been active as Iowa had advanced crypto legislation this past year. I want to kind of talk about some of the more granular political trends I see, because it's really my wheelhouse to kind of see these trends developing in front of me and being able to turn them into exploitable political spaces for the issues I'm trying to advance. So right now, and I think if you notice, like the top crypto states right now, Bitcoin states, Wyoming, Texas, Florida, Nebraska, right? Probably a good half dozen other states behind us, right? Kansas has had some movement in its legislature in the last couple of years, but one of the things I think you're seeing a desire from heartland states and also southern states to decentralize away from Washington, D.C. This is a broad trend, right? At the more local level, you're seeing, and particularly here in the United States, in the Midwest, in the Midwest we have a lot of very, very high veteran population, right? So you see a lot of veterans who are running for Congress right now. This gentleman who's coming here for the happy hour, the networking event later on, who's running for Congress in mid-Missouri, is a veteran with a master's in supply chain logistics. A lot of these people who've dealt with the Pentagon, dealt with federal agencies, not just in terms of regulation, but also in terms of their sheer bureaucracy, are now latching onto Bitcoin, right, as a way to decentralize away from DC, as a way to decentralize away from the inflationary printing of money by the Federal Reserve. Right. That's a very significant trend, and these guys, they tend to win elections, they tend to be disciplined campaigners, right, but also have, front and center experience with these, giant federal agencies. And think of the Pentagon. We still don't have an audit of the Pentagon. We may never have an audit of the Pentagon, but it is a nice thought that one day we could start, incorporating all these processes, of supply chain and procurement, and budget through blockchain, right? So, other political trends I see, you have, I don't want to talk about, any kind of ideological side to any of these other, outside of the wheelhouse, political issues, but, from the local level, and up, you're seeing, think about the school choice movement that's kind of like fostering right now, right? You have more people running for school boards at the local level and more people interested in education policy, right? These people are all trying to decentralize control away from state capitals and from the federal government, right? That's another area where I see a lot of political opportunity to inject, conversations about Bitcoin, conversations about decentralized governance into, the larger, political discussions that, So let me backtrack a little bit. Let me talk about the process of passing legislation in Missouri. It's roughly the same in Kansas and in Iowa. But our legislative cycle goes from first week of January through mid-May, right? We have a legislature that is working 5.5 months out of the year in Jefferson City. The rest of the political year, they are in their districts. There may be special committees that hold hearings. But in 2022, that latter half of the year is campaign season, right? So here's what is going to happen in Missouri, leading up to the next election, is that in the next month and a half, 2 months, I'm hoping that, through this conference and other events and other meetups and other groups in the state of Missouri and Kansas, Iowa, Nebraska, we can pull together enough stakeholders to really have policymakers understand some of these fundamentals, right? That really have the stakeholders to drive some of the education. And you're going to kill, a lot of the innovation in the Bitcoin space if you have these bad tax policy proposals, right? Let me point out one other political trend. You had 21, maybe more state treasurers push back, write letters. You have all the banks in the country pushing back on these ideas of having the IRS surveil every transaction over $600, right? Which is just an enormously complicated and mind-bogglingly stupid idea, right? But to me, that's another opportunity where you can inject a discussion about decentralization and be about using, Bitcoin as a hard currency, at the state level. Look at what Wyoming did. They have now allowed for the state. I think a few states have actually begun the process of letting you use Bitcoin to pay taxes or to pay government fees, right? So you now have state treasurers that are really pushing back on these bad surveillance ideas of the IRS, right? That's a political opportunity for us to work with our state governments and push back on the bad provisions in the 6050I, portion of the infrastructure bill, right? But to go back to the Missouri political process, so what I'm hoping to do, right, is get enough stakeholder interest, right, to go through the Wyoming, legislative framework, pick out some of the things that we think are most practical and easiest to accomplish, right? And if you have any understanding of politics, most people eventually come down to the belief or to the practice of incrementalism, like small gains, compound over time. Eventually, you get to where you want to go. But if we can pick some of the low-hanging fruit, taxation of Bitcoin gains, or to minimize taxation of Bitcoin capital gains, I should say. If we can, create, take on some of these ideas that, Wyoming has pioneered, that are bringing in innovation, bringing in, creating a safe shelter, if you will, for innovators in Wyoming, right? If we can take some of those ideas, go to State Representative Philip Finelli, by the end of the year, get a piece of legislation drafted, right? Our goal is to have a hearing in the House committee, by March, right? Or, maybe if we're lucky we get a vote on the floor of the House, right? Maybe if we're really lucky, we get someone in the Missouri Senate who says, I am ready to take this on. Now, one organization I want to kind of shout out is a group called Young Americans for Liberty. Has anyone heard of this group? Okay, so Young Americans for Liberty is kind of an offshoot of the Ron Paul political movement from like 2012, right? And what these guys do is, they're essentially libertarians, right? They're essentially Ron Paul libertarians. Anyone who's in Young Americans for Liberty is pro-crypto, pro-ending the drug war, pro-criminal justice reform, anti-tax, right? So what they do is they recruit heavily from college campuses, and then they go knock doors for state representative and state senate candidates, right? So in the last election cycle, they elected like 150, maybe 200 state lawmakers around the country. Not a lot necessarily in percentage terms, but these guys definitely punch above their weight. Now, Philip Crispinelli and other lawmakers in Missouri who already have an awareness of Bitcoin and crypto, these tend to be the lawmakers who are elected with the assistance of groups like Young Americans for Liberty. So pay attention to that group, right? They're helping create political change and political education at the local level, right? That's something that in 2 or 3 years will translate to, federal advocacy. But Young Americans for Liberty, they've won races in Missouri, Kansas, Iowa that I'm aware of. And all of those lawmakers who are elected are getting ready to really take on the crypto space. So like I said, hopefully we get, go through this process in 2022. Obviously, we're not going to pass something unless something really amazing happens. But if we can get through the legislative session in Missouri by, mid-May, then we're in campaign mode, right? At this point, it becomes our project to really engage the world of elections and candidates, right? The first step is, as constituents, being able to meet with these candidates. The second step is, as individuals, as investors, as companies or decentralized organizations, support these campaigns, right? If we can, in Missouri right now, we have, I think, 2, maybe 3 congressional seats that are open seats. We have Mid-Missouri Congressional District 4. We have Southwestern Missouri, that's Congressional District 6, Billy Long seat. Those seats are open seats, as well as our U.S. Senate seat, right? So those are the areas where we can have the most impact, because especially in a contested primary in a Republican state like Missouri, the question is, who's going to differentiate themselves from the pack, right? And not just that, but oftentimes I will work with a candidate who supports my issue, not because I think they're going to win an election, but because what I want is that, if they lose an election, that's fine. What I want is that, next election, whoever's running it for that same seat in that primary or in that general election looks at those campaign finance reports and sees there are 20 Bitcoin companies that supported this candidate. This is a constituency I can compete for, right? So sometimes I support a candidate I know is not going to win just to put that out there, right? Because I know that in 2 years and 4 years, it's going to make a huge difference, right? In 4 years, that incumbent politician might be on the ropes. They might come back to me and say, how do I talk to your constituents about this issue, right? That's when you have really made traction, right? So, politics is a game of cycles, right? You have 2-year cycles for state representative and for federal United States representative. You have 4-year cycles for governors, attorney generals, state treasurers. You have 6-year cycles for U.S. senators, right? And a lot of these campaigns are managed by firms or by consultants who, half of their businesses is to talk to other consultants or to look at the records, look at the track record, look at the public record of the last campaign, and figure out where they can have an imprint for that candidate. So, do I have any questions at this point? So like, one thing that's going to make a difference, federally in 2023 is if we elect Taylor Burks from Mid-Missouri, if we elect other pro-Bitcoin candidates from, other jurisdictions. There's a black woman, I forget her name, running in California as a Democrat against the most anti-Bitcoin member of Congress, right? If we see some of those people win their races, or if this woman in California raises $1 million from the Bitcoin community, right? That's going to have a huge impact even if she doesn't win the race, right? It'll put a big flag out there that shows other candidates, hey, we gotta be stepping on the gas on this issue, right? So where that turns into real action is when that candidate gets elected, starts pressuring these federal regulatory agencies, right? So Congressman Jason Smith from Southeast Missouri, he's if the Republicans retake the House of Representatives next year, he's going to be the chairman of the United States House Budget Committee. That's an extremely powerful position. He's also going to be, if not chairman, one of the ranking, members of the the House Ways and Means Committee. Does anyone know what that committee does? Taxes. They do taxes. That's probably the committee that we should be talking to, right? So, if you're concerned, about the regulatory policy side of this, right? These are the levers that we need to be pushing 2 years out, 4 years out, right? So
So Eben, I've got a really specific question, and I don't expect you to know the answer, but I'm hoping you do. In that infrastructure bill, they put in a specific provision to, I think it's IRS code 6050I.
That's right.
Is there a time that provision is going to take effect?
Yeah, January 1, 2024.
For that provision specifically?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Because that'll make criminals out of most of the Bitcoin community.
So the executive director at, I think, CoinDesk was talking about this last night. So, and I agree with his entire analysis. Jerry Brito, I think, is his name, so you can look him up on Twitter. But he pointed out, look, we at least have the potential to go back to Congress in 2022 during an election cycle and craft legislation to roll this in, right? At the very least, to minimize the amount of discretion that the Treasury Department, that the IRS, that the SEC, that the Commodity Future Trading Commission has, right? So we have 1 year before the election to begin this pushback, right? The second thing that we can do is win federal seats in this next election in November of 22, right? And if the Republicans retake the House and the Senate, which it seems very likely at this point, I mean, look at some of these election results. You have a Republican win Virginia governorship, which Biden won by 16 points in the last presidential election, right? You had a Republican win that state, right? You had the governor of New Jersey, almost lose. New Jersey, narrowly escaped electing a Republican. You had the New Jersey Senate leader lose to a Republican who's I think he's a truck driver. He spent like $153 on his campaign, most of it at Dunkin' Donuts, right? So people are really, really pissed off right now. People are really, really pissed off about inflation, right? And one of the things I think we as a community can do is if we can tie Bitcoin as a solution to these inflationary pressures and to Federal Reserve printing money, we get, right now we have a moment where we can really punch through the popular consciousness, right? Because ordinary people, may not understand blockchain, their kids might, right? But ordinary people who are trying to put food on the table, trying to, put gas in the SUV or in the minivan, right? They may not understand cryptocurrency, but they sure as shit understand inflation, right? And if you point out to them that there is a new, hard currency that can decentralize power and control away from DC and from the Biden administration, that could be a very definitive thing in the November 22 election, right? Because every Republican in the country is going to be running on that, and some smart Democrats are going to be running on that. You know, if they're not.
Make sure you know the 13 Republicans that voted for that.
Correct. Yeah, there are 13 Republicans in the House that voted for that infrastructure bill. I think half of them are not running for re-election. You know, like Adam Kinzinger from Illinois, he got redistricted out of the seat. You know, so some of them will not be around anymore. So, what time do I have? Okay. Let's ask more questions.
So, I know recently the Treasury Department issued some statement on, I think it was mostly stable coins, but did it relate to anything else in particular? And I didn't read too much into it, but
I think it was the White House. So the White House, with input from Treasury, put out a big statement on stable coins. Caitlin Long says it's a giant federal power grab. So yes, that's another very concerning issue. But did you have a specific question there?
well, I just didn't know if that was like going into effect, if that was just like guidance, or if it was like a position
It was
statement.
kind of a report, kind of a position statement, but it indicates the direction that the Biden administration is going to take. Right. So now, like I said, if the Republicans retake at least the House and the Senate, I think it's likely they take both houses. But you know, even if they take back one side of Congress, I think we can potentially push the brakes on some of these bad policy ideas.
So, given the FDIC and the legacy systems with banks, how long can we reasonably expect it before they start to accept with criminal, like Walmart?
You know, Vanity Bank, so Caitlin Long's bank just applied for FDIC insurance.
Okay.
So that's really interesting, right? I don't know quite what to make of it, if it will work. But I suspect that the days of these ideas are beginning to be numbered, right? And I don't mean by the next 2 years, next 4 years, but maybe in the next 6 to 10 years, right? I think you're going to see, you know, so a lot of my experience in drug policy is that, 12 years ago, the number of politicians who were open to marijuana legislation, for instance, were like old hippies who got elected to office and the very young electeds. The body of the establishment was like not interested, right? And what had to happen was that you had to just elect new people, right? So a lot of the change in marijuana policy and drug policy generally has been catalyzed by just electing young people, right? So Taylor Burks, who's the Republican candidate for Congressional District 4, just walked in. Taylor, do you want to come up and introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, or how do we become those young people like this guy?
I don't have an answer for you on that.
Hey guys, so I just really want to hear Ethan's talk. I'm a Navy veteran, got into Bitcoin a few years ago. Went to high school with a guy named Stephen Cole, who told me a lot about Bitcoin a few years back, and I was a passive observer, got plugged in, decided to take the plunge in 2016, 2017 time frame. Was still in the military, in politics. I held local office. Just got back from my third deployment, running for Congress in the fourth. A lot of issues that face the fourth district, but crypto is one of those things where I think we have the future of currency, the future of fiscal policy for our government that's going to be affected by cryptocurrency. So I'm eager to hear what Ethan has to say about regulatory proposals or thoughts or regimes that we're going to face on the federal level.
Let me ask you this question.
Yeah.
So
I'm not prepared at all for this.
you had a great interview with Austin Peterson
Yeah.
recently where you talked about how Bitcoin gets us away from this, Federal Reserve funding.
Yeah.
Can you kind of elaborate on give us your thoughts on that?
Yeah.
And also, with a little specificity in terms of your experience with the Pentagon and with these voters' budgets.
Yeah, so I think those are two kind of separate issues that are related. But we see on the federal level that there's no such thing as any sort of discipline when it comes to our fiscal policy. And that bleeds into spending policy. So monetary policy, spending policy, related, but certainly two different sides of a coin. At the Pentagon, we're seeing budgets that are $700 billion plus every year, and the Pentagon has told the Congress, we can't even account for this money. And that kind of tells you that there's probably no basis in reality for what that dollar means if an agency like the Department of Defense can say, we just don't know. Like, it's somewhere, we assume it's somewhere, and they have no clue. Tying that to monetary policy or fiscal policy, where the Fed prints, you talk about quantitative easing, you talk about the taper is kind of the most recent term that's being thrown around. Interest rates are related to federal monetary policy, and on the conservative side of the aisle, for a long time we've seen conservatives push for a concept called audit the Fed, or return to the gold standard, some of these things where we want some basis in reality for what our fiscal policy is. And I told Austin, we're in a digital age. The ship has long since sailed where we're going to have a gold standard for the US dollar, or where we're going to be able to audit and hold accountable an agency the size of the Federal Reserve. But we have a thing called Bitcoin. We have cryptocurrencies that can be like Bitcoin. I think a lot of central banks are looking at creating their own. I think Bitcoin is how we avoid that centralized control and what the United States should be about. We see countries like China that try to clamp down or create their regulatory regimes so they can create a centralized, controlled cryptocurrency, a digital yuan, and that's what China was always going to do. They're an authoritarian country that wants to control every aspect of their society, including their currency. That's not the basis of the United States free market, and so we need to fundamentally, as policymakers, be supportive of a decentralized digital gold asset class, and that's what our free market should be underpinned by, not by something that is dictated by Federal Reserve policy or a central bank, but something that the market supports and the market creates. And so I don't know what that looks like from a congressional, a legislative perspective, other than as much as we can keep our hands off of fiscal policy, cryptocurrency policy, or regulations at the SEC, or pick an agency that might try to regulate, the better we're going to be as a country because of the enormous power of this new technology, this financial technology that has enormous potential, not just for us as Americans, but globally, on how we can escape the control that we've seen from just loose doesn't even describe fiscal policy anymore. Non-existent fiscal policy, where we're just creating numbers to satisfy an itch among addicted policymakers in, pick the capital.
So,
Off the top of my head, guys, sorry.
now, Taylor, your website?
TaylorBurksForCongress.com. Been, like I said, advocate for crypto for a long time, and a part of my campaign is advocating for that when I have the opportunity to talk about it, and then opportunities to contribute and support my campaign with crypto through the website. Taylor Burks for Congress.
Thank you, Edward.
All right.